In the winter of 1951, Soviet ace pilots flying the revolutionary MiG-15 began reporting something that terrified their commanders. They were dying in ways that shouldn't have been possible. American F-86 Sabres were hitting them with bursts of gunfire from angles and distances that violated every principle of aerial combat. The kills were too clean, too precise, too consistent. Soviet intelligence launched an immediate investigation. What they discovered would shake their confidence in their own air superiority and expose a technological gap that threatened to alter the balance of the Cold War. The skies over northwestern Korea, in a corridor pilots called MiG Alley, had become the most dangerous airspace on Earth. This wasn't supposed to happen. On paper, the MiG-15 was the superior aircraft in nearly every measurable category. It could climb to 50,000 feet, while the Sabre struggled at 42,000. Its rate of climb was nearly 50% faster. The MiG could outturn the American jet at high altitude and carried devastating firepower. One 37mm cannon and two 23mm cannons that could shred an aircraft with a single hit. The F-86 Sabre, by contrast, was armed with 650 caliber machine guns, weapons that seemed almost quaint by comparison. American pilots needed to land multiple hits to bring down a MiG. They were flying an inferior aircraft with inferior weapons. Logic dictated they should have been losing this fight badly. Instead, the kill ratio was running 10-1 in favor of the Americans. Soviet pilots, many of them veterans of the Great Patriotic War against Nazi Germany, were being shot out of the sky with disturbing regularity. The Soviet Air Force Command demanded answers. They debriefed surviving pilots extensively. The reports were consistent and baffling. American pilots were firing from positions that should have resulted in misses, from deflection angles that required impossibly precise calculations to compensate for the relative motion between two aircraft moving at hundreds of miles per hour. Human beings simply couldn't perform the instantaneous trigonometric calculations required to make those shots. Yet the Americans were making them over and over again. Soviet intelligence officers began to suspect the answer wasn't superior pilot training or tactics. Something else was helping the Americans aim. They were right. Inside the nose of every F-86 Sabre was a black box roughly the size of a car battery. It was called the A4 Radar Ranging Gunsight, and it represented one of the most closely guarded secrets of the United States Air Force. This device, developed in the classified laboratories at MIT, was doing something that seemed like science fiction. It was allowing pilots to see into the future. The story of the A4 begins not in Korea, but in the skies over Europe during World War II. Allied pilots quickly learned that shooting down enemy aircraft was far more difficult than anyone had anticipated. A fighter pilot, closing on an enemy bomber, had to account for dozens of variables simultaneously: his own speed and trajectory, the target's speed and trajectory, gravity's effect on the bullets, air resistance, the curvature of the bullet's path. At distances of just 300 yards, with both aircraft maneuvering, hitting a target became a matter of luck as much as skill. Gun cameras mounted on Allied fighters revealed an embarrassing truth. Experienced pilots were missing far more often than they were hitting. Studies showed that fewer than 2% of fired rounds actually struck their targets. The military was expending enormous quantities of ammunition to achieve minimal results. Even when pilots did score hits, they often couldn't explain exactly how they'd done it. Successful gunnery was more art than science, dependent on instinct and feel that took hundreds of hours to develop. Most pilots were shot down before they acquired that expertise. The problem was fundamentally mathematical. To hit a moving target from a moving platform, a pilot had to aim at where the target was going to be, not where it currently was. This required solving a complex differential equation in real time while pulling G-forces, watching for enemy fighters, and trying not to collide with the target. The human brain, even a highly trained one, simply wasn't fast enough to process all these variables with consistent accuracy. Engineers at MIT's Radiation Laboratory had been working on radar technology throughout the war. In the final years of the conflict, they began exploring whether radar could solve the gunnery problem. The concept was elegant. If a radar unit could measure the exact distance to a target and track how that distance was changing, a computing device could calculate the precise point in space where the pilot needed to aim to ensure the bullets and target arrived at the same location simultaneously. The first prototypes were crude, but they demonstrated the principle was sound. After the war ended, development continued in secrecy. The project took on new urgency as tensions with the Soviet Union escalated and the military realized the next war would be fought with jet aircraft moving at speeds that made the gunnery problem even more difficult. By 1949, engineers had refined the system into a functional unit that could be installed in the F-86. The A-4 worked through a process that happened in milliseconds. A small radar dish in the nose of the aircraft sent out pulses of radio energy. When these pulses bounced off an enemy aircraft, the A-4 measured the time delay and calculated the range with extraordinary precision. The system then tracked how this range was changing, determining whether the target was getting closer or farther away and at what rate. Simultaneously, mechanical computers inside the unit factored in the Sabre's airspeed, altitude, and angle of attack. With all this data, the A-4 solved the ballistic equation and projected a small illuminated pipper onto the pilot's gunsight glass. This pipper showed exactly where the pilot needed to aim. The pilot's job became almost absurdly simple. Put the pipper on the target and squeeze the trigger. The A-4 handled everything else. It was compensating for all the variables that had made aerial gunnery such a challenge. It was giving the pilot a solution to a calculus problem faster than any human could think. The system wasn't perfect. It had a maximum effective range of about 800 yards and worked best when the pilot was approaching from behind or at moderate deflection angles. Extreme angle shots still required pilot skill and judgment. But within its operational envelope, the A-4 was devastatingly effective. It transformed average pilots into marksmen and gave exceptional pilots capabilities that bordered on superhuman. The Air Force classified everything about the A-4 at the highest levels. Pilots were briefed on its existence and trained in its use, but they were forbidden from discussing it, even with other pilots. Maintenance crews who worked on the units had to have special security clearances. If a Sabre was shot down, recovery teams had specific orders to locate and destroy the A-4 unit before enemy forces could examine it. The military understood that if the Soviets learned the secret of American gunnery success, they would rush to develop their own version. When the Korean War began in June 1950, F-86 Sabres, equipped with the A-4, arrived in theater in December of that year. Almost immediately, American pilots began reporting kills that surprised even them. They were making shots that felt impossible, watching their bullets converge on enemy aircraft with uncanny precision. The MiG pilots, expecting traditional dogfighting tactics, found themselves being hit before they understood what was happening. Soviet commanders initially attributed the losses to pilot error or American numerical superiority. But as the kill ratios became impossible to ignore, they ordered systematic investigations. Intelligence analysts examined bullet hole patterns in recovered MiG wreckage. The patterns were too tight, too focused. They suggested a level of accuracy that shouldn't have been achievable in high-speed combat. Debriefings of pilots who survived encounters with Sabres revealed that Americans were firing shorter bursts than expected, but achieving better results. One Soviet pilot who ejected after being hit reported something strange. The American pilot had fired from what seemed like an impossible angle, yet the rounds had struck with precision along the MiG's fuselage. Another pilot described watching tracer rounds curve through the air in a trajectory that suggested the American had somehow predicted his evasive maneuver. These reports, compiled over months, painted a picture of technology, not just training. Soviet engineers began examining the F-86 through whatever means they could. Crashed aircraft were recovered and analyzed. Defectors were questioned about American technology. Intelligence operatives in the West tried to gather information about American avionics development. Slowly, the picture became clearer. The Americans had developed some kind of automated aiming system, likely radar-based, that was giving their pilots an enormous advantage. The realization was devastating to Soviet military leadership. The MiG-15 had been designed as a technological leap forward, proof that Soviet engineering could match or exceed Western capabilities. The aircraft itself was excellent, but the Americans had nullified its advantages with electronics. The Soviets had focused on aerodynamic performance and raw firepower. The Americans had focused on making it easier to hit the target. In aerial combat, hitting the target was all that mattered. This technological gap represented more than just a tactical problem. It symbolized a broader concern that would haunt Soviet military planning for decades. The United States was pulling ahead in electronics, computers, and precision guidance systems. The Soviet Union could build excellent aircraft, tanks, and artillery, but the Americans were building the systems that made those weapons more effective. The A-4 was an early warning of a shift in military technology toward miniaturized computing and automation. Soviet engineers rushed to develop their own ranging sights, but they faced significant obstacles. The miniaturization required to fit a radar and computer into a fighter's nose cone demanded manufacturing capabilities and component quality that Soviet industry struggled to match. American vacuum tubes and early transistors were more reliable and compact. Soviet attempts to reverse engineer captured technology often resulted in systems that were heavier, less reliable, or both. It would take years for Soviet gunsights to approach the capability of the A-4. Meanwhile, in MiG Alley, the slaughter continued. American pilots, many of whom didn't fully understand the technology that was helping them, racked up kill after kill. The A-4 gave them confidence to engage in situations where they might have previously broken off. They could fire from longer ranges and at more difficult angles. Soviet pilots found that the defensive tactics that had worked against German fighters in World War II were less effective against Americans who seemed to anticipate every move. The psychological impact on Soviet pilots was profound. They began to believe American pilots possessed almost supernatural abilities. Morale suffered. Some pilots became hesitant to engage Sabres, even when circumstances favored them. The technological advantage had created a mental advantage. American pilots felt invincible. Soviet pilots felt outmatched. In air combat, where split-second decisions mean the difference between life and death, that psychological edge was nearly as valuable as the technology itself. Back in the United States, the engineers at MIT who had developed the A4 watched the kill reports with quiet satisfaction. Their creation was performing exactly as designed, but they were already thinking about the next generation. If radar could help with aiming, what else could it do? Could it help with navigation, target identification, threat detection? The success of the A4 validated the entire concept of using electronics to augment pilot capabilities. It opened the door to the computerized weapon systems that would define air combat for the rest of the century. The A4 remained classified long after the Korean War ended. Not until years later did the full story emerge of how a black box weighing less than 50 pounds had changed the balance of power in the skies. Soviet military archives eventually revealed the depth of their concern and the resources they devoted to closing the gap. American pilots who had flown with the system finally spoke openly about how it felt to have a computer solving problems faster than thought, to watch the Pipper settle onto a target and know with certainty the bullets would fly true. The lessons of the A4 extended far beyond aerial combat. It demonstrated that in modern warfare, technological sophistication could overcome numerical or performance disadvantages. It showed that the side which could most effectively integrate computing power with weapons would control the battlefield. It proved that secrets, when properly guarded, could provide decisive advantages, and it established a pattern that would repeat throughout the Cold War. American strength in electronics and computing technology offsetting Soviet advantages in other areas. The kill ratio in MiG Alley remained 10-1 throughout the war. Soviet pilots flying superior aircraft continued to die at rates that shocked their commanders. The A4 wasn't the only factor. American pilot training was excellent, tactics were sound, and many individual American pilots were genuinely exceptional. But the A4 was the multiplier that turned good into great and great into legendary. It was the secret that couldn't be beaten by courage or skill alone. In the frozen skies over Korea, the future of warfare had arrived in a small black box that most people would never hear about. The age of the electronic brain had begun, and nothing would ever be the same. Some Cold War truths were buried on purpose. We dig them up here. Subscribe to Cold War Black Files.